Journey IFC strives to create safe spaces to worship God. Know that you are welcome just as you are, regardless of religious background or lack thereof, skin color, political affiliation, sexuality, age, culture, or any other label you own or society throws on you. You are welcomed and celebrated here just as you are. Our reading today comes from the book of Matthew, and this is talking about an undiscerning rain that falls on everyone. So here's our reading. You have heard it said that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. However, I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them the 2nd mile. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn away from anyone who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Bless those cursing you. Do good to those persecuting and hating you, so that you may be children of your parent in heaven. For God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Poor tax collectors. And if you greet only your siblings, what more are you doing? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly parent is perfect.
I like that.
Yeah, right? Good, you shouldn't like that. This is how I know I have you all pegged, is that I had the same reaction to this story. But we'll get to that. We have some time. So this series that we've been calling Rain or Shine has been all about times of rain and drought throughout various biblical stories, because we were in a bit of a drought, you may remember. Now we're finally getting rain, thank God. You may remember back to the very beginning, I made y'all do that crazy watercolor thing where we sat in a circle. There was a bunch of fun colored tablecloths, all of that stuff. And we pondered and wondered about what it was like for Moses and the Israelites wandering in the wilderness and in the desert without any water. And then we even painted a piece that was what it would feel like to finally have water in the middle of a drought. And all of us were like, this isn't hard to imagine because we need that so bad, because we are in that period of the drought where it felt like it was never going to end. And then the next week we moved on to the prophet Amos, who talked about waters and related it to the idea of justice. And Amos reminded us that God wants rivers of water and wants water to flow and justice to flow over every single one of us like a never-ending stream. And then for the past 3 weeks, we took this kind of deep dive into the book of Genesis, and we followed this one family along several generations. And so first we had Abram and Sarah, you may remember this, and they lied and said they were siblings, and it caused a whole lot of problems. And we talked about how Abram's actions led to all these other people suffering because he was not willing to let go of power and control. And then we had the next week where we talked about how this lying and deception kind of pattern repeated into Abram's son Isaac, who was always known as the butt end of the joke. But in reading Isaac's story, we remembered how to end harmful patterns and how to challenge ourselves to disrupt these family system patterns by finding small solutions to change these systems that harm. Then we talked about Isaac's grandson, Joseph, who had a pretty eventful life. You may remember this last week, where he was left for dead in a ditch, he was forced into slavery, he was thrown into jail, and somehow through all of it, he was still successful, and he was able to heal and grow, and he became the second in command to the Pharaoh. He was responsible for handing out resources to people in this time of another famine. So all of the people that came before him, all of his ancestors who had to go and get help from other people, he was now sitting in that role, getting to give people food in a famine. We also talked about how his family was estranged, and how they came back together, and forgiveness, but it took a lot of time. And all of this, we talked about times of drought and famine, and times of need and want. We talked about how they kind of seem to coincide with all of these really great times of suffering in the Hebrew people's lives. And this makes sense for them because living in a highly agricultural-based society that was known for having droughts, drought meant death. It meant famine, and famine means mass death, and it just meant that no one was safe. And it seems that in these times of drought, these early followers of God, that their wrong actions, what they were doing wrong, caused this pain and suffering. And they thought that it brought the drought on. They thought that they were responsible for it. They thought that their imperfections were to blame. It was easier for them to explain away the bad things because there was some flaw in them, right? It was easier to say, well, it's because we did something wrong or our leader did something wrong. They didn't have water because justice was being kept from people. And they didn't have food because people were lying about their wives being their sisters and about leaving their brother for dead. But it makes me wonder, is that true? Is that how this whole thing works? Did all of this suffering through the drought and famine really result from imperfections in the Hebrew people? Well, our reading today, this morning, from the book of Matthew actually helps us clarify that a bit. I think it says that no, it's not that easy. It's not that transactional. So at this point, Jesus has gathered a great crowd of people on this mountain. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. So he's giving a sermon on a mount. And he's preaching to them, and he's teaching through these stories, and he's trying to bring new insights to these ancient laws. So that's kind of what this portion of the text is about, is new insights to ancient laws. And so Jesus begins with this law that is found 3 times throughout the Hebrew Bible, the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Meaning, if someone wrongs you, if someone causes you harm, you repay them with a punishment equal to the harm caused. And so we may say, well, that sounds a bit extreme, like that sounds a little rough, but for this culture, that was actually kind of restraining for them. They, at this time, liked to do a little bit more. If someone harmed you, you went above and beyond. You elevated and made it more extreme and really wiped them out. So to the Hebrew people, when they got this law early in, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, all that time, this was a practice in restraining themselves. It was them holding back some, learning to only respond in an equally harmful manner. But Jesus, in true Jesus fashion, pushes the law a bit further, which I love that about him. And Jesus says, actually, don't resist someone that does you any harm. Don't resist at all. And then he gives us some examples of what this looks like to help us. We're visual people. We need stories, and Jesus says that. So he's like, here's some examples. Jesus says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn and let them strike you on the other. You think, what? What does that mean, Jesus? But this practice of slapping someone was actually less about the physical pain. It wasn't about hitting someone. It was more about the shame that was involved with this. To backhand someone was a sign of utter disrespect. And so to welcome a second slap was pretty unheard of. You didn't do that. You were just disrespected. Why would you want another? Jesus continues saying, well, in matters of court, if someone sues you for your shirt, throw in your coat while you're at it. Again, this is beyond anything that the law required a Jewish person to do, so Jesus is always pushing it a bit further. And then Jesus says, if someone forces you to go a mile, and this is probably related to forced labor practices of making someone transport goods for you, Jesus says, if someone makes you go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. It seems that in each of these scenarios, Jesus is saying, go above and beyond what is asked, making sure to never resort to violence. Jesus continues in his instructions saying to give to anyone who asks of us and not to turn anyone away. He says, you know how people say love your neighbor and hate your enemy? Well, I tell you to love your enemy and even pray for those who harm you. In doing so, Jesus says that we may finally become children of God if we do this. Therefore, our birth into this new family of all creation coming together requires us to love our enemies and those that persecute us. We have to go above and beyond loving without harm to be born into this new way of life. And then, finally, the part about rain and drought comes in. Jesus said, "For God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous." Jesus is fighting directly against that ancient belief system that taught that our shortcomings lead to us being punished by God, like with droughts, with famines, with all that stuff. Jesus tells us that the rain falls on each of us, regardless of our righteousness or lack thereof. And the rain doesn't discern who is worthy to receive it, it just falls. And if that is truly the case, which I suspect it is, then why does it matter what we do, right? Why do we need to follow these strange laws that require us to go above and beyond what is expected of us, to give everything, to give our coat, to be slapped? Why do we have to do all of this if it doesn't matter, if the rain will fall on us either way? While all of these rules seem super challenging and possibly unrealistic to live out, I know a man named Tom Long, who's a theologian, talked about, if you did this in New York, if you really lived this, you would be in the hospital poor by the end of the day. That is what would happen. So while this is unrealistic and hard to imagine being played out, the part that really struck me wasn't all of that. It was the very ending where it said, "Be perfect as your heavenly parent is perfect." Come on, Jesus, right? Perfect? Yeah, that's not our thing here. We don't do that at Journey. We don't do perfect. And if you've been here long enough, you definitely know we don't do perfect. And even if you just walked by our sign, we are imperfect. That's what we put out for everyone to know. Perfection is not our thing. So in my wrestling with this week, I was pretty frustrated with that word. I talked to my wise pastor friend Jonathan, who I meet with on a weekly basis, and I was like, what the heck do I do with this? I don't know how to explain this or make sense of this. And Jonathan, like the good theologian he said, well, just check the Greek, see if you like the translation. And I was like, yes, that's a good way to start. So I, in that conversation, Googled it, and I thank God for Jonathan, because I found a sliver of hope for us that I'm going to hold on to. This word perfect here comes from the Greek word, which comes from telos, which can also be translated to several other things, such as completeness or having reached its end. So Jesus rattles off this list of laws and new ways of being that require us to go above and beyond. And then he tells us to be what some have translated as perfect, but I would argue that this could mean that Jesus is telling us to become complete or to become whole.
I like
Right? Isn't that a better translation? It could mean that we need to become fully who we were created to be. Not perfect, but just fully realized. Jesus is saying all these ways of responding to violence with nonviolence and how it allows us to become our truest version of who we are. Become this final version, this complete version of who we are. It takes us responding in these wacky ways. But then again, I think, whoa, Jesus, like, to complete our true self, to become who we were meant to be, you're asking us to do some very intense stuff, like taking a second slapping, or give double what is expected of us, or to love those that we should hate, God. Doing all of this means we have to see things in this new and challenging way. We have to go beyond what is expected. And in each of these scenarios that Jesus listed requires sticking around for a bit longer to see how things are going to shape up, right? It means not resorting to violence before grace has a chance to show up. Not just going with the, I'm going to get you back equally. It's saying, wait for a second. And being shamed or sued or forced to work, Jesus tells us to go that extra mile with one another. That's one of the things about this verse that I liked is he says, if someone tells you to go 1 mile, go with them the second mile. It's a radical reordering of the justice system that requires both parties to be in relationship with one another for a little while longer so that the story doesn't end there, that the story can keep going. See, because we cannot be told to love someone and then just be expected to go out and love them that simply. It doesn't work that way. I wish it did. I wish I could say, go love your enemy, and we could go out and do it. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We're going to fail every time if we try doing that. Instead, what we have to do is we have to take the time to learn to love people. People that are different than us or that think differently than us. Maybe who are our enemies. It takes us sticking around long enough to see something worth loving in these people, even in the people we deem evil or that we call the enemy. It means not giving up on one another. As I was saying, we're perfect here. To love like this is perfection, but not the perfection we think of where there are no flaws, where our mistakes bring out punishments from God. No, this kind of love is our end goal. It's what we need to become. It's our completion. It is who we were created to be, and it is who we continue to become. But it can be imperfect, and that's okay. So often when I am preparing for what I'm going to say up here on Sundays, I will sit and ask myself, well, what is the good news that this story brings out? What is the good news? So today I believe the good news is that the sun will shine on all of us, and the rains will fall on us too. And we don't have to get everything right, we don't have to be perfect to feel the sun or to be quenched by the rains. But what we are required to do is to keep trying, keep learning, keep sticking in there. We have to stay in relationship and do life with one another, even the ones that frustrate us. So when Jesus says, walk the second mile with one another, I think that is exactly what we have to do. We have to be willing to walk through life with even those who hurt or persecute us. We have to continue to learn to love and learn to be loved. Because we are already children of God. Although this verse tells us that we have to do something to gain that title, we are already given it. We also were given this blessing that was handed down from Abram to his son and their sons. And it was this blessing that one day all people would be blessed through them. So we know that the story is not over until all of us receive blessings. But as we can see, it takes a little bit of time. It also takes some commitment to a new way of doing things. It takes a restructuring of our justice systems and social hierarchies, and maybe even restructuring our families, as we've talked the past several weeks. It requires us to share resources in times of drought. It requires us to provide shelter when the storms become too much. It may even require us to give double of what is expected of us. In all of it, it requires willing hearts and a whole lot of footwork. And ultimately, it requires relationships in one another. But don't worry, we don't have to be perfect at it. So let us go out this week and change the world by walking the extra mile with one another. But only when we can. Only when we can take it. And let's try this week to love each other double what is expected. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to take communion. We haven't done communion in a while. But what it is it's a meal that remembers a time when Jesus got with his friends, his buddies, his journeyers, just like this kind of crew. And he got bread, and he broke it, and he gave thanks to God for it, and he shared it with everyone, and everyone got enough. And he did the same with the cup, and he blessed it, and he gave it to everyone, and everyone drank. And in doing so, he said, this is a sign of what I am doing, that this is my body and my blood. That in taking in this bread and juice, when we do this, we are reminded that we are taking in this community, that we are becoming Jesus, we are becoming the hands and feet, that we are put back together just like the body and blood being put back together. And so what I invite you to do is to come forward You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get it right. You can just stumble up here. We can also even take it to you if the walk's too much right now. But know that this table is open for everyone. It's not our table. It's not limited to these people in this community. This table is open to everyone. And in this reading, I think that's what Jesus was getting at, is that the table is always bigger than we realize, that it's more open, that it pushes boundaries, and it requires us to push ourselves a little bit more. This is your time, do what you need to do, but know that the table is set and ready, and all are welcome.
Wow, what a week. Don't we always say that, though? Think of it this way. Be perfect in being imperfect. That's our job. You know, the rain does fall on everyone, the wicked, the righteous. How do we rectify that? Think about it this way. The rain has not done its job until it reaches the ground and is absorbed therein and does its real job. So let the rain pass over you. Let it do what it is going to do, knowing that on its way, it will ultimately do something good, even when it wreaks havoc with death or destruction. That doesn't make the rain bad. It's just on its own imperfect journey to being perfectly imperfect. So let the rain pass over you this week. Let it go on through to the ground and come up as something wonderful and gracious. And know that you had a part in it. Go in peace.